Just to remind you before the brief list of announcements, for which I apologize in advance, but nonetheless, I want to remind you that these events are brought to you by three organizations. First of all, the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are sitting, whose minister is a supporter of what we do, and who has told me more than once that this kind of a meeting and these kinds of discussions are part of what she considers to be the mission of this church, which is, given what you're about to hear, kind of remarkable. The second organization is a Left Forum that does the annual conference. Maria just gave you an announcement about the 2019 one that'll happen in the last weekend of June. I would urge you to take a look at the leftforum.org website starting Monday, where you can get all the information about how to attend, how to participate, how to present your own work, etc., etc. And finally, the Democracy at Work is the third organization, and that's the one I work with and the one most of my time, and the one that produces these events, among many other things. And to jump right into the announcements, we are quite proud at Democracy of Work that we have produced our first book. And here it is. It's called Understanding Marxism. And I wrote it. It's available for sale if you're at all interested. It's intended to be, it's a short book. It's thin, as you can see, and it's short and big print. Because it's meant not to be something that you will put on your night table and then after a year or two underneath whatever holds up your desk and so forth. The idea is to actually have people read it. Students, people involved in the labor movement, people involved in social movements of all kind. The degree of interest in socialism and Marxism, which you must have noticed in the media, is at a level most of us have not seen in our lifetimes before, or at least many of us haven't. And so the demand for this became obvious. And so we decided to respond to it in a variety of ways, including the production of this book. We produce it ourselves, we publish it ourselves. If you're at all interested, I think there are a couple of copies out front. But the way to order it, if you're interested, is very simple. We have a relationship with something called Lulu, L-U-L-U, lulu.com. You just go there, use the name Understanding Marxism or my name, and you can order the book at whatever convenience you wish to. Okay, this bi-monthly event now has its own Patreon page. For those of you not familiar, Patreon is an interesting service, been around a few years. It allows anyone who would like to be a supporter to get the video of these monthly events and other materials by supplying, I think the minimum is $3 a month, and then you get all this stuff. It's a way for groups like ours to get ongoing support. So if you're interested, just go to Patreon, P-A-T-R-E-O-N, patreon.com/ what's our thing? GCLEU, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update, GCLEU, and it'll take you there. If you're interested in these programs that are posted up on YouTube, please subscribe. You hit a little click when you go to YouTube to look at this thing, and then you can, if you want, get notified of everything we put up there. It doesn't cost you anything, but it gives us the support we need because, as you're learning, YouTube, like Facebook, Twitter, and all the others, keeps very close track of everything that happens, which is a polite way of saying they spy on you in every detail that they possibly can. I believe this afternoon, Facebook was indicted for the first time. It's being prosecuted by the government for violating just about everything. We also produce on our website and available for you as podcasts, three that I want to mention to you. One is produced by David Harvey. It's called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. And he produces those with us. That's our project, Democracy at Work project, where you can follow his ongoing commentaries on what's happening to capitalism. David Harvey is one of the world's leading recognized Marxist theorists, and we are very happy to have him doing that. The second one is called Puerto Rico Forward. An attorney in Puerto Rico who works with us has an ongoing commentary from a critical perspective of what's happening in Puerto Rico, to Puerto Rico, and inside Puerto Rico. That's another podcast. And finally, Capitalism Hits Home. Dr. Harriet Fraud, some of you know her. She's on our program from time to time. She's a mental health counselor and psychotherapist, and she has a whole program. It's called Capitalism Hits Home, with all the double and triple entendres that you can imagine apply to that. You can find all of these podcasts on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play. We urge you to take advantage of these things. We do a lot of this kind of work. We're going to be doing more of it. We want to become a kind of place you go to for this kind of analytical work. There is also a store where we have mugs and shirts and all of that kind of stuff. We want to make sure you're aware of it. You just go to our website, democracyatwork.info/store, and that will take you to the store. Okay, my apologies for all those announcements. Now we can get to what brought us here. I'm hoping that this evening will be, perhaps even more than normal, humorous, because as a great poet once said, these days you have to laugh to keep from crying. And so I'm going to hopefully enable you to laugh, although if you think about what I'm saying, you may very well start crying. Try to do that quietly so it doesn't interfere with everybody else. Okay, a few shorter things, and then we'll go into the bigger ones. The Boeing 737. Here's an example of where laughter will help you to keep from crying. There have been two terrible crashes. The one very recently in Ethiopia. I'm sure most of you saw the pictures and all the sad. Everybody on it was killed when the plane crashed. This is a Boeing aircraft. 737 MAX 8 is the code number of this airplane. And pretty soon after this, since it's the second crash of this identical plane in the last year, virtually every other country on Earth grounded the plane, stopped letting them fly, because there obviously is something wrong with these planes to have two deadly crashes in a relatively short amount of time. There were two exceptions of countries that chose not to ground the airplane. One was the great United States of America, and the second was, and there's no nice way to say this, the relatively servile country of Canada. Those two didn't do it, although today they did it. Several days late, so that the whole world can see the difference between what they all did and what this country did. Of course, it had no relationship to the fact that Boeing is an American company. That clearly is not a factor in any of this. That was an attempt at humor, what I just did, okay? Okay, good. I just want you to be with me as we do this. If you needed an example of the profit motive and that kind of thing outweighing concerns about safety, this is about as good as you're going to get. It ranks right up there with being more concerned about selling arms than about bone saw assassinations of journalists, which seems also to have been relatively unimportant. Many of tonight's short items are comments on the state of this society, and I would like to urge you to make it as explicit as I know how, to begin thinking about the society we live in as disintegrating, as falling apart. Something I have not thought most of my life, and only recently began, as it all kind of crowded in on me, to begin to think like that, which is itself interesting that I should think like that, having not done so for most of my life. So here's another example. And if you haven't caught this story, I really do urge you to take a look at it, but it's fairly new in the news, so maybe you have. The FBI and California and other police folks, over the last 24 hours, arrested, I think it's about 20 people or 30 people who were what? 50. 50, my apologies, even more. Maybe there'll be more tomorrow, who knows? who were involved, and the number is impressive, who were involved in an elaborate program operating for years that was a conspiracy. It involved bribery, it involved not paying taxes, an immense array of criminal charges that have been put against all of these people who have been arrested. Here's what the basic thing was, and that's important for you to understand. This was a program that charged an enormous amount of money to wealthy people who understood that Sweetie Pie, that's their children, hadn't paid a whole hell of a lot of attention during high school, which led them to be in the situation that getting into college would be a major challenge, which is a polite way of saying no way were they going to get in to school. For many of these young people, as I'll explain in a minute, they didn't want to. But their parents had other ideas. That happens sometimes. And the parents were determined to get Sweetie Pie into a properly reputable school. By the way, the schools include Yale, University of Southern California, UCLA, Georgetown, fancy, pretty well, you know, high up there in the rankings of American universities. And so they did a whole host of really creative things, mostly involving bribery of officials at the university to change grades, to ignore grades. They also bribed people who are in charge of those SAT and other kinds of exams so that whatever Sweetie Pie's grade got magically grew over a weekend. They arranged for people other than Sweetie Pie to take the exam in Sweetie Pie's name. They even studied Sweetie Pie's handwriting so that the substitute could write roughly like he or she did. They got ingenious. I was interested in the Yale example because I went to school there and I have a deep affection for the institution. And the way it worked at Yale was they had a coach, I believe a soccer coach, if I recall the details. And what he did was to designate a particular person who was trying to get into Yale and, as I said, had no opportunity to do that, to make that person designated as a recruitment for the team. See, it turns out, this may come as a shock, it turns out that colleges use the application process to have a more successful team than if they just took students based on their capacity as students. I told you this might come as a shock because it begins to erode your concept of meritocracy. The notion that you get where you get in American society because of the hard work you put in and the aptitudes you have and the capabilities you develop. I know many of you want to believe that, but it is right up there with believing that the color of Mr. Trump's skin is natural. And you know, you should outgrow that at a certain point if life is not overwhelming you. So here's what they did. This coach at Yale would be given money in exchange for designating such and so as a recruitment candidate for the soccer team. Then Sweetie Pie would get accepted at Yale because they want to have a good soccer team. You know why you want to have a good soccer team? Because it enhances your ability to learn? No. Because it pleases alumni who give money. Keep that in mind, the alumni who give money. So you're accepting students to get the money. The students who have a lot of money spend the money to get the position that will get them having the money that their parents already had to get them in there. This suggests a continuation of wealth, doesn't it? They fired him at Yale, assuring everybody, the president of Yale did yesterday, that he was the only person who ever did anything like. He was full of shock and dismay. Yale was. And if you believe that, then again we have reference to the natural color of the president. Okay? The guy who perpetrated all of this, who has turned state's evidence, the FBI got to him, so he then ratted out all the people he'd worked this plan up with over the years. Another touching commentary on our society. He had set up a foundation. You know, if you set up a foundation that helps poor children get into college. Then you don't have to pay taxes. So the wealthy people who have tons of money and wanted to spend it to get Sweetie Pie into college couldn't, of course, take it off on their taxes. There's no slot there on the tax form. Bribing is not, you can't deduct bribery. And putting it down would get you into potential trouble. So nobody paid for the service. They made contributions to the foundation to help the poor children, of which there were none, get into college. That way they could deduct what they were paying as a bribe as a contribution to a charitable. This is America. You live in this. Now, of course, this is illegal, a lot of this stuff, which is why they got arrested. But there are legal ways of doing this that happen more or less, I would say, on the average every 5 minutes. People give money. Suddenly, the candidate looks a lot better to the university. You do know how Jared Kushner made it to Harvard. If you don't, look it up. Okay? I remember, since I also went to Harvard, unfortunately, my parents had no money, which I've held against them all my life. I remember noticing in the dormitory at Harvard when I went there that a good number of the young men in the dorm with me were very, very unhappy at Harvard. They really didn't want to be there. They couldn't do the work. They didn't like doing the work. They never had studied. They didn't understand the point of it all. They were coming from good families and knew that their father would get them a job when they were done. It wasn't really, what were they there for? They would have rather been doing anything. They were very, very unhappy, but their parents told them, you have to go. So there they were. And many of them couldn't do anything in the classroom. They were given what Harvard proudly in those days told everybody was called a gentleman's C. In other words, at Harvard, if you came to class and you were demonstrably not dead, you got a C. If you bestirred yourself to go to the library, just a bit, you got a B. And if you actually paid attention, you got an A. And very typically, those who came from public schools, which were a minority at Harvard, were the ones who got the A's because they were used to sweating it, because they came from families which saw this as a way out of where the family was. That was my family, and it would be a way out by sending their little Sweetie Pie to this school. And you couldn't do it with money since they didn't have any. Harvard has asked me every year since I graduated for money. I always write back on the form, you must be kidding. You should give me money. I never get a reply. Never. It's extraordinary. And it leads me to say, because I want to, this business about meritocracy, it dies very hard. I have tried in countless classes that I've taught all my life to explain to people that the notion that the way this country works is that it looks for the best qualified person to give an opening to, or a job to, or an opportunity to. That's not true. That has never been true. Meritocracy is a very bad joke, and you shouldn't be fooled. Meritocracy is an idea invented to handle a very practical problem, particularly in capitalism. Here's the problem. The number of jobs of any kind, particularly good ones, is limited. The number of young people who would like to get those jobs is much larger than the jobs that are available. Just like the number of people who want to go to Harvard is very large, and the number of people accepted each year is much smaller than that. Okay, you've then got a real problem in a society that doesn't provide important, interesting, and well-paid work to everybody who wants it, which would be the logical way to handle this. We can't do that. That conflicts with profit. So we limit it. But then we have a problem. We have to tell an awful lot of people, you're not getting that job. You're not going to that school. You're not getting that opportunity. And now we have a moment of great crisis, because it's possible that the people denied all those opportunities might understand that they're perfectly qualified to go there. And therefore they might become, get ready now, angry that they're being denied an opportunity that they're as good at, taken advantage of, as lots of other people, but they're being denied. The society couldn't survive that level of anger since the majority are the people that are denied. There's thousands of people who want to go to Harvard. The class that comes in each year is maybe, 800 or 900. So you got a lot of people you're pissing off. It's very important that they don't think of it as the failure of the system. They don't think of it as the failure to provide an interesting job to people who only ask for the opportunity to work hard, but it's something that means something, both to them and to their community. You don't do that in capitalism. Biggest growing job right now is being a greeter at Walmart and other exciting work. So it's crucial to get people to think that if they don't get that opportunity, it's not the fault of the system, it's your own fault. It's you. You don't know enough. You didn't go to the right school. You didn't major in the right topic. You didn't work hard enough. You didn't get enough A's. You see, it's all your fault. So screw you. You're just getting what you deserve. The only thing you should be angry at is yourself. So now slink off, go to the bar like everybody else, and try to forget it. But don't get angry at the system. This notion that it's your fault, that's meritocracy. Telling you the idea that the people who got the opportunity merit it. They're smarter than you, they worked harder than you, they're better prepared than you. Stop. That's a way to get you to be docile, to be resigned to what is done to you, rather than to become a critic and an oppositional figure. Very effective, very effective. I can assure you, since we're talking about universities, since I did spend my entire educational life at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, that's the only places I ever went, I was surrounded at all times by people who were not good at what they were doing, who didn't like doing that. They didn't want to. They were good at plenty of interesting things, but being a student wasn't one of them. They didn't want to be there. It was the family that said to them, you must. You will be a failure in the eyes of your mother, your father, and the people in our circle. You must. And you mustn't just go to anyone, you must go to one of those. That's why if you're in trouble, if Sweetie Pie really has nothing to show, then you have to go to one of these services and buy it. And they're all ready to do that, and it goes on. I was surrounded by these people, loads of them, all the time. And they were used to it, because they had been sent to private schools as youngsters. They had been to private elementary, secondary. College was just the next rung. These were the people who endured the 4 years of college, got their bachelor's degree, and never went back to anything, didn't pick up a book, had no concept of any of these things. And I'm not saying that these were not smart people. They were. Interesting, capable in all kinds of areas. Some of them found their way to being good at a sport or at business or something that they actually were interested in. But being in the school, that was a purchased commodity, and it had nothing to do with merit. Don't do that to yourself. Blaming yourself is not healthy. Don't do it. And don't let the system fool you into accepting it. Next short item. A Chinese corporation has been in the news practically every day since our last get-together here 2 months ago. Huawei, or I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it properly, but I'm sure many of you have heard about this. This is a 5G technology communications company based in China, a Chinese company, and it has been having trouble. It is, by the way, the technological leader. It has the best quality, pretty much everybody agrees to that, the best quality of this kind of 5G, latest kind of communications equipment in the world. By the way, itself an interesting sign that the Chinese are now able to become number one in this, and that's not the only field where they are ahead in this way, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But suddenly, they came on to, by the way, they've been around for many years. It's not a new company. Its technological specialties are not new. Its skill in this area is very well known. But suddenly they came on the radar. You may have heard about it if you paid some attention. A high executive, the daughter of the founder of the company, was traveling in Canada, was arrested at the Vancouver airport by the Canadians on a warrant from the United States, accusing her of violating the embargo in trading with Iran and several other things. And they've held her in a kind of semi-detention in Canada to this day, awaiting extradition. If that gets worked out, she will be sent to the United States for trial, presumably. Here, a very extraordinary thing to do, clearly designed as an attack, as a way to get at the corporation. That was followed then by a program that continues to this day, led by Trump, led by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and others, attacking this company on the grounds that it represents a security risk. In other words, if you buy and install Huawei equipment, they will have the ability, maybe, it's murky and no real evidence yet has been put forward, but the accusation is they are close to the government in China, and that the government in China either has already or could or might or would use its power over a China-based company to get their equipment to function as a kind of spying mechanism or eavesdropping or hacking or a variety of ways that electronics can be used. Okay, this is the charge and this is the accusation. A number of countries, Australia particularly, I don't remember them all, have now told Huawei they won't buy their material or they won't buy part of what their product line is in deference to this notion of the security risk that they represent. Other countries have been noteworthily unwilling to do that, including Great Britain, Italy, important countries in the world do not agree with the United States about this. But that's not what I want to stress for you. Here's what I want to stress. To be aware of the utter absurdity of this. Until a year or two ago, the world's technological communications equipment was overwhelmingly American. The United States government has very close relationships with Apple and Google and IBM and Cisco Systems and all the others that produce this stuff. If the rest of the world was worried about the security of their communications, it would have been the United States, whose virtual monopoly on that stuff would have exercised them for the last 25 years. And as if that weren't enough, I don't know how many of you remember, but early in Mr. Trump's presidency, he went to Germany, where he met with Angela Merkel. And they had a press conference. It got a lot of attention because Mr. Trump had the extraordinarily bad taste to make a joke as he's standing on the podium next to her about how the United States, under Obama, by the way, had eavesdropped on her and her telephone. Let's stop and review. The United States used its technological capabilities, well known. By the way, why do we know the United States is very good at spying on people? Because it spies on us. It's been caught doing that half a dozen times. So we know the government can do it. We know the government has done it to us. Sure as hell is going to be doing it to other people. And they got caught doing it to the leader of Germany, ostensibly an ally, whose phone was hacked by the United States. And our president made a funny joke about it. If you ever go see that clip, you'll see she didn't laugh, Mrs. Merkel. Not even a little. Not a little. So what is this? There might be a possibility that the Chinese, could you believe it? That the Chinese company might be doing what we have been doing for 20 years. What is this outrage from? It's as phony as a $4 bill. Don't be fooled by this nonsense. By the way, might the Huawei company do it? My presumption is they might very well. I presume these companies are doing that. I presume every country is trying to make sure that they don't get that real well. Interfere in it, block in it, give them false information. The usual things countries do. When one country gets a new technique, you discover how to block, thwart, undo it. But the notion that, oh my God, the Chinese might, what? You really have to get sucked into the crazy propaganda to take this stuff seriously. Yes, my guess is that Huawei does some of this. My guess is IBM does it, and Cisco does it, and Google does it, and Facebook does it. You get it, of course you do. And every country is trying to undo that, to block it, to confuse it, to mess it up. That's what you do. That's what these countries do and have been doing for centuries. As they develop techniques to spy on one another, they develop techniques to block it. That's not new, that's not surprising, and it has nothing particularly to do with China. Last step, because it's another issue here. The Chinese, claim made, steal our technology. Now, there's two things about this to keep in mind. One is really ugly, so I'll only mention it briefly. There's a certain racism here. There's a certain notion that we white people have a really good scientific, and if they seem to have some science, they must have stolen it from us. So I won't go in there. You can all let that float around in your head if you hadn't thought of it before, which you should have. But here's what the Chinese did 30 years ago. They made a decision, a strategic economic development decision. They were going to do what the Soviet Union couldn't and didn't do. They were going to hitch their star, their hope to go from being a poor, backward country to becoming an industrial powerhouse. They were going to do it by becoming an exporting company. They were going to do it by producing cheaply better quality than the West was producing for itself. And they knew they could not do that by themselves. They needed two things which they didn't have. One, the technology to produce efficiently, cheaply. And number two, entree, because it's one thing to produce the stuff, you have to distribute it. You have to get a way to get your better stuff, cheaper stuff, into the markets that the mass of people with money go to. And their decision, therefore, meant they had to cut a deal with the West. They had to cut a deal to acquire the technology and to acquire the distribution system. Here's how they did that. They invited companies in. British companies, German companies, Japanese companies, American companies, Canadian companies, and so forth. And they said to them, very explicit, we are going to provide you with cheaper labor than you ever dreamed you would have. Not just cheap, well-educated, disciplined, used to working, hard work. We'll take care of all of that. And number two, as we develop our economy, we will give you entree to sell your products here in China. You get the workers and you get the market. But the deal was, we get the technology. Nobody's stealing anything. No American company had to go there. No one had a gun to their head. You want the cheap labor? You want the market? No. Give me. That's what they did. Real good bargaining of the sort you learn in business school. No stealing. By the way, was there some stealing? Of course they're stealing all the time. One cookie company is stealing the recipe from another cookie company. They go to court. That's how we know they're stealing, because the courts are full of what is called industrial espionage. It goes on all the time. I'm sure the Chinese do their share. But the notion that this is some peculiar specialty of the Chinese, that's right up there with Huawei being possibly a security risk. It is, to use a technical term, crap. And you shouldn't be attracted to crap, and if you are, you need to work on that. Okay? By the way, historically, you should enjoy a little reminder. When Britain was the empire that ruled the world, the British businesses were constantly saying that everybody coming up to attack or to compete with the British had stolen their technology. You know who they accused that of? We, the United States, stole the technology. The Germans were accused, because they were big competitors, of stealing. Every country that is challenged by an upcoming new country competitively has told the same story. Don't be fooled. It's just a rerun of a very old movie that we're being treated to. They stole our technology. Come on. What are you going to do, hide your technology? If you didn't make a deal with them, they would buy one of these products and they'd figure it out themselves. They do that anyway. This is a game. Let me remind you of a sad case in American history. At the end of World War II, as you know, the United States was the only country on earth to drop nuclear bombs on other people. 2 of them in Japan. You all know that? Some of you are looking at me, so I can tell you didn't know that. Well, you should. Okay? It then became very urgent for the other countries in the world, particularly those that saw the United States as an enemy, to catch up, because not only did the United States have a devastating weapon, but the United States had indicated it could and would use it. And if you ever seen what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 2 cities in Japan where the bombs were dropped, that would be scaring to anybody. So the Russians, the Soviet Union, went to work intensely to get the bomb. Americans said, they're Russians. It'll take them decades. Nothing to worry about. 3 years later, they had it. Analysis in the United States was, they stole it. Because you could, that Russians? Russians? They couldn't have done it by themselves, just like the Chinese couldn't have done it by themselves. They had to steal it. But it went to the point where 2 people were arrested, a husband and wife here in New York City. They were arrested, and they were charged with having leaked the secrets to the atomic bomb from the United States to the Russians. And they were executed here in the United States. Those 2, that couple. Rosenbergs, I presume most of you know that. So this is heavy stuff. This blaming of people stealing our technology, that has a very dangerous track to which it goes. Okay, let me turn, because I want to leave enough time to do the China stuff properly. Let me turn now to the budget. I had been interested in talking to you about the budget deficits, but I got upstaged. I didn't know it was coming so soon. So a couple days ago, Mr. Trump very conveniently released his budget for fiscal year 2020, which is the year coming up. And so I want to talk to you about that budget, okay? There are a number of things very interesting that you have to understand. You're going to be reading and seeing a lot about it. It is the job of the president to prepare a budget and send it to Congress. However, it's the Congress that decides what's in the budget, not the president. His job is just to, here's an idea, or here's what I would like to see, but it will be up to the Congress. Now, when he did it the last couple of years, he was dealing with a Republican-controlled Congress, so what he wanted was kind of mostly what he got. Now, with the Democrats controlling the House of Representatives, that's not going to happen that way. There's going to be a lot more fighting about it. But nonetheless, it's the starting point for everybody, and it tells you a lot about where the mentality is, and I think there are interesting things you can pull out of it. Okay? All right, so let's start. The single biggest item, as is always the case with us, is the military. So let's talk a little bit about the military. This last year, the military got about $700 billion. $700 billion. Okay, that's a lot of money. And that's what goes to maintain the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and all of that. And the military wanted more this year. They wanted, in the neighborhood, I won't worry about the exact numbers, but roughly 730 million. They wanted it to go from 700 to 730. Okay. The Trump budget proposes 750. In other words, the Trump government is offering to give the military more than the military asked for, which the military assumed they wouldn't get all of. This is a way, this is very technical now, this is a way to keep the military happy. It's doing what they want. It's giving them more money than anybody else has, more money than they could possibly want. It is more money than they requested. And it is clearly a reward for the stunning victories they have achieved in Iraq and Afghanistan. You do know we are officially negotiating with the Taliban in Iraq. We've been there for whatever it is, 16 years. And in the 16 years of war, we are negotiating with the people we went to war again. And the negotiation is about when and how the United States leaves the country. Only in America can this be portrayed as a victory, but that's what's being done. Iraq, the government there is now closely working with the Iranians. I don't know if you're following this, but that too is a glorious bust. So we have a military with two extraordinarily long wars that they have basically lost. And so clearly they ought to be given more money. Now here's how this is going to play out. Mr. Trump is making sure, and please don't be so naive as to think there's anything mysterious going on here. He's taking care to make sure that the army is not a problem for him. Mr. Trump, as you've probably noticed, has been stunningly successful in making an enormous number of enemies at home and abroad. I don't recall a president of the United States who is normally and regularly referred to in at least half the newspapers of this country as a perpetual liar. It's really quite extraordinary if you think about it. So he's got a problem. There's all kinds of people who don't like him, not even a little. And he's not doing much about that. It's not going real well for him. If the army were to make the decision that he's not good for the country, that could really tip the whole story. I know many of you think that this kind of thing only happens in other countries. It doesn't. They didn't think it would happen there either. He has to keep the army happy, and that's what he's doing. He's been doing that from the day he got in. You notice that he often nominates generals for various jobs? Hello. That he has nothing at all in the way of criticism. He will criticize his intelligence agencies, and not the military. And when he steps out of line, the military lets him know, hello, Donald, that's not going to happen. Did you notice when he announced that the United States are going to withdraw from Syria? Basically, the military told him, no, we're not. 3 days later, he fumbled and bumbled, and now it's all on hold, and maybe it'll happen, and maybe not so much, and we'll leave some there. So he has to take care of the military, which he's doing. The Democrats, not to be outdone, are going to say, that's too much for the military. We have to have money for social programs. That's their tune. And they will fight and they will yell and they'll come to a compromise. And the compromise will be, I bet you, to give the military about $730 billion, which is kind of what they wanted. It will allow Mr. Trump to go to his base and say, I moved them up from 700 to 730 billion. And it will allow Mrs. Pelosi to go to her base and say, I brought them down from 750 to 730. Both sides will declare a victory, and we will all have lost. So it goes. That's the American political system. It's really extraordinary. That's much more important than the detail that he asked for 8-point-something billion for that wall that he earlier asked a good bit less for. He won't get that in any case. Strange. Put it together with the other group that he takes care of, employers. The tax cut in December of 2017 was for the employer what the rising defense budget is for the military. It was a gift. It was a gift of billions and billions of dollars that suddenly they didn't have to pay. Those corporations loved it. They know that Mr. Trump, whatever else he may be, and many of them don't like good parts of him and what he does, but they're not going to dislodge somebody who gave them the biggest tax cut in history, at least in recent history. And he gave it to them in 2017 after 30 or 40 years when profits of corporations went on a tear. It was a period of American history when they needed it least that they got the most. Of course they're going to support Mr. Trump. He's wonderful. He's as wonderful for employers as he is for the military. And just a little footnote, because I know some of you, don't get into the intricacies of this. Just follow the logic. He cuts the taxes on corporations and the rich in December of 2017, which means over the last year, 2018, the one just done, a vast amount of money that the government used to get in those taxes, it didn't get. So the revenue of the federal government plunged. But in order to get the tax cut through, he had to throw a few bones at the Democrats. So they didn't cut spending on social programs, actually raised it a little bit. Okay, you with me? If a lot less money comes into the federal government, but they spend a bit more, they're going to run what economists call a deficit. They're going to be spending more, but they're taking in less. And the only way to do that, the way our government is set up, is for the federal government to borrow the money. To borrow so they can continue to spend, they have to borrow because the taxes aren't coming in, since they cut the taxes on corporations from 35% to 21% on profits. That was the cut. A 40% cut in 1 year on your profits tax. Well, where does the government go to borrow all the money that isn't coming in taxes from corporations and the rich? Now get ready, because if you understand this, you're going to be very upset. They turn around to those same corporations and those same rich people, and they borrow the money from them. And the reason is simple. You don't have any money to lend to the government. That's why it doesn't come to see you. You're too piss poor. They go to where the money is. And where the money is, they created by the tax cut. So for a rich corporation or a rich person, here's how the deal looks. Instead of paying taxes, goodbye my money, I get to loan them that money. They're going to pay me back, and while we wait, they're going to pay me interest. What kind of rich person would turn that down? None of you would turn it down, but you're not a rich person, which is why you never heard of this before. You're not in this game. You are the victim of this game. And part of your victim situation is you didn't know it. And what the United States government can't borrow from the corporations who now can lend it because they don't have to pay taxes, and the rich people who now have that money to lend because they don't pay taxes, what they can't get from them, if they need to borrow more, they borrow from the People's Republic of China, which is the largest single creditor of the United States government, which I will come to in a few minutes. You live in this. Do you realize with the debt the United States has to the People's Republic of China, that a good part of the taxes you all pay is collected by Washington from you? Right? April 15th is the day you have to pay your taxes for 2018. By April 15th, a month from now. A part of the taxes you pay, all the Washington government does is take it and send it as an interest payment to the People's Republic of China. Billions and billions of dollars that you pay in taxes that the Chinese use to help develop their military. Do you understand? You are funding the putative enemy. You poor, poor schmuck. And if you didn't understand it, that's part of your schmuckdom. That's part of what happens to you. If you either become economically illiterate or no one puts it together for you. Next item, Mr. Trump's proposed budget. Hold on a second. Mr. Trump's proposed budget has massive cuts in social programs, partly to offset the money going to the military and also to do something about the enormous deficits, because if you remember in ancient history, the Republicans were against deficits. They now run them enormous, but they're worried about that. Okay, so they're proposing, among other things, an enormous cut in Medicare support. Also a cut in Medicaid. Medicaid, the cut isn't so big, but they're going to give it to the states, which is a very bad thing, particularly in half the states of this country. But Medicare is going to be drastically cut. This is interesting for 2 or 3 reasons. One, when he ran for president in 2016, Mr. Trump guaranteed, he must have said it 50 times, that he would never touch Social Security, Medicare, those entitlement programs. So the game is over. He may be taking care of the military in the way I've showed you, and he may be taking care of the employers. But when it comes to the mass of people, promises, schmomises. When you all hear from the civics-minded folks amongst us how sad it is that half of the Americans don't go to vote, 2/3 of Americans don't pay attention to the politics, that could care less, part of it is this endless experience of voting for somebody who simply goes some other way, like the opposite when elected. Yes, Americans keep hoping that the next generation, the new ones, will behave differently. But when that doesn't pan out, a lot of people turn off, and can you blame them? Well, you can, because it's going to hurt them by not voting. But you sure can understand why they would take that route, given their behavior. And look at Mr. Trump. He's cutting the environmental program. The UN is in a panic because he's cutting the amount of support the United States gives to the UN, which means that UNICEF and half a dozen other agencies, peacekeeping and others of the UN, will not be able to function if that budget goes through. So it's a massive cut of what the social programs are. At a time when the American people are very upset and angry, their jobs are not very good, their incomes are not very good, they haven't really recovered from the great crash. Yes, we have a lower level of unemployment, but the jobs that our people are getting are crappy jobs, low pay, no security, and few benefits. Not the kind of jobs they lost, but the kind they're now desperately having to take because they can't get anything else. And then he's going to hit them with a tremendous cut in medical coverage. We are already the country that gives the least amount of generalized health insurance to its population, while charging people a greater share of the national income for health care than any other industrial country. We pay more for less. Amazing. So a president who does that, who helps the military, who helps the employer class, those are minorities in our society. While screwing the majority has got a political problem, a big one. If you're going to screw the majority, let alone lying about it and now being caught, exposed, while you help the minority, you better have some way to distract the majority from what it is that's going on. You better make sure they don't think about it, they don't read about it, they don't see it, they don't talk to one another about it. Get them focused somewhere else. Make sure you send out 6 to 10 tweets a day about other things, like marauding Hondurans coming into Texas. Get very excited. Debate a wall, a big wall, a steel wall, a cement wall, a wall, no wall. Fight about a wall, because this allows you to debate whether people who aren't white are okay to come into the country, whether Hispanics are too many by some standard. You can get into all these wonderful, it's like, Let's debate about, abortion or anything else. Just get it away from the fundamental game being played here. Debate lots of topics. MMT, modern monetary theory, for those of you who don't follow it. Debate this detail, that detail. Get all excited about the nice dress that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez purchased and whether that's consistent with being a socialist. What? The kind of reach you have to make. But you're living in that. And that's a really important awareness you need to have, lest you get caught up. Even the stuff about Huawei, stealing our secrets. This is exciting. You can have an endless discussion about whether they're stealing. You have no way of knowing whether they're stealing or not. You know why? No one does. Because one of the things these companies make sure is that the minimum possible number of people are aware. It's too dangerous if many people know what's going on. So that's highly secret. Nobody knows whether any of this is true. This is all make-believe. This is PR, propaganda, whatever words you want. And to take it seriously means they've succeeded. You are actually lost in this junk, and therefore you're not focused on where it is that your interests lie. Suppose I told you, which is my view, that the American economy is disintegrating, that it really is a society falling apart, that it has fundamental problems that are showing up in the kinds of people we elect. Not just the president, but the right-wingers to his right, the left-wingers that are beginning to become an important force in the Democratic Party and beyond it. These are signs that the middle is not holding real well. It's dissolving. The middle of the income distribution, the middle of the wealth distribution, and the middle of the politics, the conventional middle of the road, George Bush's, Hillary Clinton, all of that. They're having a harder and harder time. People are not reproducing that stuff because that's dead. And that's a sign of something not cohering in this society. The society's problems are fundamental, and the political parties are working their rear ends off, not to talk about that, not to engage it, not to analyze it, not to diagnose it, and not to come up with programs to deal with it. They're going to deal with other things, which means they don't want to deal with anything. They just hope it'll somehow muddle through. Here's another society that's going through this same process slightly differently, but you can learn from them. The working class that suffered the most since the crash of 2008 in terms of the decline in its standard of living in the Western world are two. The Greeks, we all know about that story, but the British working class, terribly, terribly affected. No respite. A conservative government, basically, that imposed austerity as its response to the collapse of capitalism. And the British working class really hurt, tangibly hurt. Angrier and angrier, didn't know where to turn. Labour Party was not attracting them. Conservatives were repulsing them. In their rage and anger and not knowing where to go, they did a bizarre thing. They took advantage of the stupidity of the Conservative Party. Mr. Cameron, the leader before Theresa May, who's now the leader, Mr. Cameron was confronted by a bizarre movement in the British population, blaming, ready, immigrants. Should strike a familiar tone. But not immigrants from Latin America, that's our specialty. Immigrants from Europe. See, it turns out that the crash of 2008 really did a number on many of the Eastern European countries. They had just come out of their position within the Soviet system. They were kind of trying to find their way, and before they could kind of get going, wham, they were hit by the collapse of 2008. So they were desperate. So tens of thousands of Polish workers had no jobs. And so they went to England, where their skills in construction and other techniques were much appreciated because you could buy a Polish worker for a lot less than you could buy a British worker. So the British were outraged, and so the right wing arrived, always in time, like the Lone Ranger. And they said, yes, you British working people, you know what your problem is? It's all those immigrants. It's Europe. And those immigrants can only come here because we're part of Europe. So the solution to our economic problems is to get rid of the immigrants, and the way you do that is you withdraw from Europe, because then they can't come as Europeans because we're not in Europe anymore. Mr. Cameron figured, I got to get rid of this. This is disruptive. I don't want to lose Europe because England is dependent on Europe more than ever. England is now more and more what it once was, a small, cold, wet island off of the mainland. There's a big Europe, and then there's this little England. That's very hard for the British because they were once the rulers of the world. Now they are sort of like Staten Island. I don't mean any disrespect to Staten Island. Okay. So the British fooled Mr. Cameron. He thought he'd have a quick election. They would say, yes, we stay in Europe, and he could get back to imposing austerity on them. But they wouldn't have it. In a fantastic gesture, the British people rose up and gave the finger to Mr. Cameron, the middle finger, in case you didn't catch that. And they voted to leave Europe. They bought the argument, not because they were persuaded, but they were so angry at what had happened to them. It's kind of like large numbers of American workers were so angry at what had happened to them over the last 30 years that they voted for Mr. Orange Face. They didn't care that he had an orange face. They developed a taste for orange faces. That's a sign of rage and anger. And partly they like him because he articulates rage and anger. He gives the finger to the establishment, and they like that a lot, just like the British. The problems of the English economy are they don't have much to sell. And they have become a society of very wealthy and a mass of poor people, just like us. They have to deal with that problem, but they don't know how, and they can't face it. So they focus on in or out of Europe. The British working class will not be affected very much either way. This is a crazy focus. It's crazy in England to be spending all this time. By the way, they had 2 votes in the parliament. Today, just in one day, 2 different votes. In or out, or in. It never stops. It plays the role in England that our wall in Texas plays here. Crazy stuff. And if you live in a society that is becoming crazy like this, that's a sign things aren't going well. Nothing is being solved here. The problem just festers. The inequality grows, the instability grows. It's extraordinary. We live in extraordinary times. All right, in the time I have left, I really want to hold on. I want to talk to you about China and the relationship between the United States and China, because it is becoming the dominant economic story of our time, and that means for the foreseeable future for everybody in this room. China is now the number 2 economy in the world. There's no question about it. They've eclipsed Europe, they've eclipsed Japan, they've eclipsed Russia. They're it. They're the big player. And that has to be understood, or else you're lost in propaganda junk. First, the Chinese did this in 30 to 40 years. That is astounding. They went from a very poor, challenged, and difficult country. When I was a young person, someone handed me a book. It was called The Good Earth, and it was written by an American writer, Pearl Buck. How many of you, so a good number of you. Well, you remember that book? You remember the descriptions the kind of society that she was telling us, because she went there and she lived there, she knew what she was talking about. She tried to give people who read that book, beside the storyline, a sense of what the poverty and tragedy of China at that time was. Okay. They never were a colonial country, but they were heavily impacted by colonialism. It took those pieces like Hong Kong, Macau, and so on. It repressed that Boxer Rebellion, some of you know about, at the turn of the century into the 20th century. A very difficult society riven by the opium trade and the British Empire's behavior towards them, and so a horrible story, colonialism. And then 40 years ago, they made that deal. We're going to become rich, we're going to grow, we're going to become a successful economy, and we're going to do it by export. We're going to produce the goods for the world. The clothing, the shelter, the appliances, everything. We're going to copy, we're going to bring in the foreign enterprises. We're going to open China up to them. They've always wanted it. We're going to give it to them. We couldn't get it if we didn't. Europeans tried over and over again, could not do it. The Chinese said, okay, come. And here's the deal. We'll give you the workers, we'll give you the market, you give us a technology. Not only the technology, you give us, remember, I told you, the distribution system. And who gave the Chinese the distribution? Some of you have heard me do this before. Walmart did that. Walmart, I'm not joking. Walmart cut a deal with the People's Republic of China. Walmart would become the seller of everything the Chinese produced, underpricing and out-qualitying everybody else. So this obscure company from Bentonville, Arkansas, that's where they come from, Bentonville. I won't ask how many of you have spent your vacations in Bentonville, because you all know. So now it's the largest employer in the United States, largest private employer in the country, Walmart. And that's only possible because of the People's Republic of China, which cut a deal because Walmart could deliver the cheap Chinese goods into every corner of the United States. They solved the distribution problem like that. All they needed was a partner. That's why they've learned how to do it. That's why the biggest danger to the Amazon Corporation is the Chinese company that's doing exactly the same thing, only on a bigger scale. All of which you will learn about in the years ahead. And China did it. That's the amazing thing. That they set out to do it is one thing, but they did it. In those 40 years, they became an industrial powerhouse. Every one of those years, I would go to seminars with other economists where I would sit there, and many of them are famous, you know their names, and they would tell me how we cannot take seriously the Chinese are claiming that they're growing at 6% a year, at 8% a year, at 10% a year. This is at a time the United States is growing 2 and 3% a year. Year after year, I was told, and none of this is true. Now, it's all there. Who's going to claim it anymore? There's still some who try, but it's fading fast. Take a trip there. We have a housing shortage in the United States. In China, they have whatever the opposite is. They have a housing excess. They have entire cities waiting for the people to come and occupy the apartments. They're building ahead. Can you imagine, just bear with me for a minute, a society that builds houses not because people are homeless and need them, but before they need them? Can you imagine the irrationality of this? I'm trying humor, folks. If your population is growing, and if you're moving people around the country, which the Chinese were doing, you have to create housing. Otherwise, you know what happens when you do that? Economic development, you move people off the countryside and they come into where the industries are. You produce slums. That's what capitalism always did and always does. On the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria, on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, on the outskirts of Calcutta, you name it. There are people who live in conditions that nobody can believe unless you go there. Because nothing is done for those people. In China, they're building the cities and the housing so they can move in. In the last 30 years, several 100 million people have moved from one part of China to another. It's the greatest mass migration in human history. They pulled that off. You know what kind of an organizational task that represents? You have to redesign your transport. You have to redesign your housing. You have to redesign every sewer system in every community to handle this craziness. They did all of that. Nobody thought they could. They did. And I'm not here to celebrate the Chinese. There's a lot of things in Chinese society that deserve criticism, and that's not the point here. The point here is to understand what's going on so that you can make a criticism without descending into caca, which is the pretense that they didn't achieve all that they did. They're very depressed in China this year because their economic growth rate is 6.5%. The United States government just announced that our growth rate in the last quarter of 2018 was 2.9%. You get the picture? It's really bad in China when it's 6.6. Mr. Trump is boasting he's going to keep it at 3. No wonder they're catching up. That's like a math problem. If I grow at 2 to 3% and he grows at 6%, who's going to be taller sooner? It doesn't take advanced math to understand this. Now, what is it about China that we have to understand? Number one, they also made a decision a long time ago, with much struggle, that their economic system is going to continue in the old structure of employer-employee. They did not break with that. They made some experiments to break with it. The commune movement back in the 50s and 60s, they made efforts. But they abandoned those, rather like the Soviets, who also made efforts back in the 1920s and 30s and then abandoned those. And it's a very interesting story, because it's different, why each of those societies did not continue. So they stayed with the employer-employee. But here's what was different about them. They decided that the dominant group of employers would be state officials, that they would be part of the state organization, the state apparatus. At first, that was the overwhelming majority. But over time, and particularly after Deng Xiaoping and others, they gave more and more into the hands of private capitalists, private employers. So you had side by side private employers with their employees and state employers. And that's what you have to this day. A complicated mixed system of state employment and private employment, state capitalists, if that's what you mean by capitalist as an employer, and private employers / capitalists. And whatever else you have to say, that was their recipe for the success they have achieved. They grew at a scale no one had ever seen before. The economic development miracle of the 20th century was the Soviet Union. And the economic miracle of the last 40 years has been the People's Republic of China. And you can dance up and down and tell yourself one ideological, self-delusional nonsense after another, but there's no way around that. There it is. And if most of the world is poor countries that want to become rich, it's really clear what the model is that works best. It's not what we have here. It just isn't. Are there things that the United States has that the Chinese don't, that the Chinese would be better off if they did? I think so. But economic growth and getting out of poverty, not one of them. There it is. That's the importance and the power in the long historical road to all of this. And the Chinese know it. The Chinese understand their success. A paper was released by the European Parliament today in which for the first time the Europeans refer to the Chinese as their number one rival. Interesting word. The Europeans are getting it too. And the Europeans are split. The Germans are very frightened of what the Chinese represent. The Italians are embracing them. The Italians are going to be, like the Greeks already are, the agent of the Chinese in Europe. Any of you know the port in Greece called Piraeus? It's really part of Athens, but if you go for an hour or so by car from Athens to the nearest port, Piraeus is this great old Greek port that is an entryway into the European market. The port of Piraeus was purchased some years ago by China. It is a Chinese entry. And the next one is going to be in Italy. The next time you go to Palermo, you will be eating Chinese food. Seriously, the world is changing very fast, and the Chinese are a major player. And the United States doesn't know how to deal with it, neither intellectually, nor ideologically, nor practically. This attempt to arrest that woman, Huawei, this attempt to tell these fantastic stories, can you imagine they might be using their technology for reasons not associated with good things? This level of dissimulating nonsense, that's a sign of people who haven't got their act together. That's too crude. That's too easy for me to make fun of, which I do, as you can see, every chance I get, because it's delicious. When your enemies and your opponents make such mistakes, it becomes easy. So what's going to happen? The Chinese have long ago figured out that the United States is going to be a problem. The United States was so confident that nobody would ever catch up to us that it didn't do the work it should have. So the Chinese have understood that one day that export-focused development is going to hit a snag. The rest of the world is going to realize, uh-oh, the Chinese are taking over everything. They're producing everything, and they're going to close them out. And the Chinese had prepared for that. One of the reasons they're building all those cities before people, they need to give jobs to people. And if the jobs can't be in exports because the United States is hitting them with tariffs and other parts of the world are closing down, they're going to have to focus and become a domestically focused economy. Their focus on exports has to change. They've been working at that for the last 5 years. They understand that they're dependent on energy from the outside. They don't have the oil and the gas that they need. So they're going to have to make very careful planning, because if you're depending on energy, which is fundamental, from outside, you better have good friends. You better be able to lose it over here and gain it over there. The single most important negotiating game for the Chinese is to buy off Mr. Trump by buying American natural gas. It becomes liquefied, they cool it, becomes liquefied, you put it in a freighter, and you ship it over there. The United States wants to be China's provider of energy. Now, they can't say that because that looks like we're asking them for something. And you can't play that game, because if you're going to distract your people with fantasies of marauding immigrants, you can't be out there looking to cultivate the Chinese. But the United States really doesn't have much choice. Well, it always could. It always could decide that in the struggle between the United States and China, that the only thing left, if you're losing for too many years. By the way, best estimates, 2030 to 2035, the Chinese economy will be bigger than the United States. What? Not on per capita, no, but on total output, GNP. No, per capita is a much bigger, they have 1.5 billion people. It's 5 times the population of the United States, so it's a different story. The other alternative is war. Capitalist countries that ended up competing with one another, that's how they solved the problem. Britain was once in the catbird seat, and the Germans came up, and the Americans came up, And we had 2 world wars to sort that thing out. That changed everything. Will it get to that point? Who knows? Given the sophistication and the suave nature of our diplomacy, our Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, delivered himself in the last couple of days of a remarkable set of comments. He was outraged that the New York Times had released 2 stories over the last week that really made his life complicated. The first story was that the humanitarian convoy trying to get into Venezuela, which had exploded and burnt, hadn't been exploded and burnt because of what Maduro had done, but it was the other side that did that. Ostensibly an accident, but nonetheless the other side. This was not what the official line was supposed to be. This is Mr. Evil Maduro who doesn't want humanitarian. That was the first thing. The second thing was when the New York Times, I believe yesterday or the day before, carried a story which indicated that the collapse of the electricity in Venezuela was at least partly the activity of the United States government. This he was not happy to see, since it became, of course, instantaneous front-page news everywhere in the world, except here, as your faces give you away that you weren't aware of it. But if you lived anywhere else, you would be. So now the United States, so Mr. Pompeo was beside himself. He didn't denounce the New York Times because he's afraid to do that. So he denounced RT television and the Sputnik radio, which is RT radio. Russia Today, RT stands for Russia Today. And the Russian Today spokespeople said, "What are you yelling at us for? We just quoted the New York Times." Well, we didn't do anything, But he has to, this is part of the game of focusing upset, anger, rage but it's an old story. If you keep telling yourself delusional fakery, the person in the end you convince is yourself, not other people who have other access to other kinds of news. This is a society that is in terrible shape, and it is not doing itself any favors. That tax cut in December of 2017 makes this society even more unequal than it was before. If that budget or some version of it that I just talked to you about goes through, it will continue. This is a society that is now being torn apart by the inequality that it is generating. It's not like other societies. If we had been unequal like that for hundreds of years, then, for better or worse, people would accept it more than they do now. They would be used to it. They would have inherited the acceptance of it from their parents and grandparents. But we went through a very bizarre history in this country, which makes that road unavailable to us. We had a collapse of capitalism in the 1930s. And in a reaction to that collapse, a left grew up in this country, a powerful one. The CIO, the 2 socialist parties, and the Communist Party working together, forcing on a middle-of-the-road democratic government led by FDR into becoming a social democratic pioneer. In the midst of the Depression, Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, and public employment of millions of people. None of those things had existed before in the United States. You created a mass of people with a kind of decent standard of living. Not everybody treated equally, not at all. African Americans notably underrepresented in the beneficiaries of the New Deal, for sure. But nonetheless, compared to what could have happened and what in other countries did happen, you created a big middle class here. Workers with a decent salary. When I was going to school at Harvard and Yale, my teachers told us that capitalism was a wonderful system because it created a big middle class, which other societies didn't have. Your problem here in America is this. You're now forcing a population that was told that it should support capitalism because it creates and sustains a good middle class. You're now living in a society which is being told, particularly its young people, you're not getting that. That's not available anymore. You're going to be stuck with loans you can't pay back for the rest of your life. And you're going to see your public services taken away, and you're going to see your job benefits undone. You're not going to be able to get married. You're not going to be able to have children. You're not going to be able to do any of the things you were told were waiting for you, were your American dream that you were entitled to. A society that was told to expect a middle, being plunged into no middle, that's explosive. And that's where you are, and that's where we are. And the distractions of these stories about airplanes that can't fly and Chinese that are stealing our stuff, I mean, it's just childish, desperate screaming of a society that can't face what's actually a problem, a set of problems, and runs away into self-delusion, like a society that's just torn itself apart for the last 2.5 years over whether it should be in Europe or out of Europe, should have a hard border with a northern island or a soft border. Stop. It's like if spending all of our time figuring out whether a cement wall or a steel slat wall is what we ought to build. What? This is craziness. Americans are no more crazy than anybody else. So if Americans who are no more crazy than everybody else are acting more crazy than everybody else, it's a sign. It's a sign of a society in real dissolution. Last point. I'm struck by the phenomena, as I think many of you are, and certainly many Americans are, of this very vibrant young lady from Queens, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Somehow, in this bizarre moment of American history, this young lady, with all her energy and her kind of zest for life, is the embodiment of socialism. I mean, what a strange arrangement. There's not a critique of her at all. It's just, what a remarkable moment in a society that an old man from Vermont opens the space to be a socialist after 70 years in which it was a 100% taboo. It was something which, if you allowed it to be used in your name, would mean instant political suicide. You would completely be irrelevant. An old man from Vermont says, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm a socialist. And millions of people find it attractive. And here comes a young woman, I believe she's 29 or around that age, 29, a waitress in Queens, who gets activated by the Occupy movement a bit and by the Bernie business and so forth, and now comes forward and holds her own amidst those old farts all around her, trying every which way in their lexicon of how to put her down. And she turns it again. She turns it around and makes it an opportunity for her to stick it to them. They not only don't slow her down, they make her a bigger phenomena than she could have been by herself. Amazing. But that's also a sign of a society that's desperate for new heroes, new heroines, new models, new images, new directions. Millions of Americans, I teach at the new school here in New York City, and my students are, and I talk to a few of them. They love her. I really mean it. They eagerly go to YouTube to catch clips of her doing this or that. This is politics that's exciting. They're interested in socialism. If you look at the Gallup polls, they're crystal clear. A majority of people under 35 years of age, a majority now answer the polling, I prefer socialism to capitalism. After 5 minutes of conversation, you understand what that means is, I don't like capitalism. They really don't know what socialism is. And for those who are beginning to learn, socialism is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that's very attractive. Look how nicely she dances. Look how sharp her questions were. Her questions made more sense in those hearings than the old farts did. The old farts were all posing. She wasn't, and thereby posed better. Those are all signs. So unlike the last times I've been here to talk with you and close the meeting with a worry that I may have depressed you, I may have told you things about the economy you'd rather not know. I can tell from your faces, and that this was intentional, we are in a different place. The chances now for real change in this society are different from anything I remember. And I was active in the 1960s. That was my political kind of time of learning. Finally, about this book. Sure, the people who are getting disgusted and turned off about capitalism, when they go first into discovering socialism, go to the kind of socialism that is the least scary, the kind of grandfatherly, Bernie type of socialism. You know, help me with my college bills, give us health insurance, do things that give us a better system, a better society. He's not taking away the ownership of the means of production from those who have it. He's not converting businesses from top-down hierarchies into democratic workplaces. He's not interested in all of that, or if he is, he doesn't feel it's safe to say so. But the people he's attracting have no such limits. They are all learning now, slowly, that there are different kinds of socialism, that the socialists have always been split and disagree amongst themselves, that Marxism is a particular kind and goes in a particular way and has particular implications. They're just beginning to discover. And that's not a surprise, because in this society it was taboo. There were a handful of people, some of which are in this room, who have been teaching Marxism over the years. I'm talking about my comrade here, Bertel Ohlmann, being one of the most important ones in this country. But this is a whole new world now. The tradition was kept alive, and now there's an enormous audience exploding, just beginning to discover it, learning that there are ways of thinking that are really different from what they're used to, that this funny word dialectics actually means something that you ought to engage. It's a different way of thinking. It gets you a different understanding. This is a time of immense discovery by people who want to make change. That is extremely hopeful. That's one of the most hopeful things for me of this time in our history. Once again, please, if you're interested, this book was written for this moment, and it may be interesting for you for that. If you're at all interested, just go to lulu.com, and there you can get a copy. We will have a film here. A professor from the Parsons School of Design, Andrea Katz, and I will be talking and answering questions after the film. It's called True Cost. It will be here the second Wednesday evening of April, right here. We did that in December with the young Karl Marx. Some of you were here for that. I think you'll find that film extraordinary. It's about what the true cost is of the clothing we all buy at Marshall's and TJ Maxx and all those places. The true cost being what happens to the children and the workers in the Asia and elsewhere that make it. What the true cost is, rather than the cost you pay. And I helped make the film. I think you'll find it a very powerful evocation of that issue, and then there'll be a good discussion afterwards, so please consider coming and doing that. And I will be back here for May, in the second Wednesday of May. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it worthwhile.